So let us discuss the concept of state and state recognition. Okay. So when we speak of the concept of the state, of course we have to define the definition of a state. All right. So let's tackle first, of course, what necessarily or what is a state. Okay. So of course the standard definition of your state, of course, according to Dean Roscoe Pound, and of course this has been cited by the Supreme Court in some or several of their decisions. Of course, a state is a politically organized sovereign community, independent of outside control, bound by penalties of nationhood, legally supreme within its territory, and acting through a government functioning under a regime of law. Okay, so of course there are other definitions. Of course, a state may be considered as a sovereign person with the people composing it viewed as an organized corporate society under a government with legal competence to exact obedience to its commands. Then of course that's the definition of Willoughby. According to Cooley, of course, this is a body politic organized by common consent for mutual defense and mutual safety and to promote the general welfare. Alright, so in these three definitions, of course, you would see or you would be able to identify the elements of the state. Okay, and these elements of the state, of course, these are definitions made by distinguished authors. But later on, we have this Montevideo Convention of 1933 that it adopted these four elements of the state. It is similar to the definitions that I said. This was also adopted similarly in the Montevideo Convention. So what would be the elements of state? Of course, we would have people. Of course, people. Then we would have territory. Then we would have government, and lastly, we would have this concept of sovereignty. If you're going to observe the three definitions that were defined by Pound, by Willoughby, and by Cooley, all of those four essential elements can be discerned in the definition. And likewise, in the Montevideo Convention, the four elements of the state are also defined or identified as to the definition of the state in the said convention. Okay, now a little bit of an overview. Of course, if you would consider right now, we are already now in the 20th century. So there are now states. We already have 180 plus states on record, in 180 sovereign and independent states. The backdrop of this is different from, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago, because of course we know that the world is changing. But of course, in around 40 or 50 years ago, the hegemony, the geopolitics at the time would show that, of course, there are nations who are not yet been independent. Some are still considered as a protectorate or a colony of a larger superpower state. Okay, so remember that the Philippines is also considered once a colony, of course, both of Spain and both of US. This is similarly situated in other states that later, other places in the world. Okay, aside from Asia, of course, if you are aware of African history, most of the territory there has been partitioned by the countries in Europe, and then eventually they give the independence later on to these African states. All right. So of course, same goes to also to the Americas. All right. Now we have now the concept of course, how are states created. So there are many ways to create a state. I think some would consider that, I cannot remember who is that legal expert, but many would consider that, the creation of the state is usually violent. It is usually, there would always be war with respect to state creation. But of course, let's see. So of course, summarized by Cruz, this is from Justice Cruz, a state may be created through these following means. Alright, so we have revolution, we have unification, secession, assertion of independence, agreement, and attainment of civilization. So if we speak of revolution, there is an upheaval there is a rise, there is a there is a some, most of the time, a violent movement in order to change the regime from the previous one. Of course, unification, there entails to be there would entail to be two or more countries. They agree to unify in order to reap some of the possible benefits of such unification. If you can recall, Germany is the last state, not necessarily. Oh yeah, it's the last state which, you know, created the unification. All right. So remember that after communism has fallen in 1990, the East and West Germany unified again as one Germany. The discussion right now is, of course, about Korea. There are already talks about whether or not North or South Korea would merge later on as one Korea. Of course, in unification, it is not just an easy ball. It is not an easy ball to play. Why? The unifying states would have to consider all of these factors, especially economic factors, because not as I always say, not all states are created equal. Especially in the situation with North Korea, I think the plight of the people there are particularly well documented. It's just that the North Korean government of Kim Jong-un still follows or does the state policy of not really telling everything. Okay, so yun naman ang, even sa time pa ng lolo ni Kim Jong-un, yun naman ang polisiya ng, that's already the policy of North Korea. Of course, if you are South Korea, you have to think, would we inherit the debt of the North Koreans in the worldwide stage? Would it affect our economy? The issue on unification, these are not easy, or these are not just proposals that you're just going to approve. There would still be economic, social, cultural factors that may be involved before settling on a unification of states. Okay, all right. Then we have secession. When we speak of secession, the state is a part of a larger territory, but for some reason they got out of that mother country to declare themselves as independent states. So one example would be, of course, Singapore. Singapore was originally a member of Malaysia, but 2 years later, after Malaysia declared independence, it's a forced secession in a sense, because if we're going to read back the history, it's practically Malaysia expelled Singapore. What Lee Kuan Yew did was, well, he was forcibly made to declare his independence, so practically it's a secession by itself. But well, look what happened to Singapore. Singapore is one of the better economies here, not only in Asia but in the entire world. Okay, then East Timor. Remember that East Timor is usually from Portugal. It's a Portuguese colony. Then in the 1970s, Indonesia expelled the Portuguese there. They expelled the Portuguese there in East Timor. Problem with East Timor is that, well, unlike Indonesians, which are predominantly Islamic or a Muslim state, East Timor because of course they were part of Portuguese territory, or they're a Portuguese colony. For all intents and purposes, most of their culture is Roman Catholic or Christian in nature. That is why there is a difference between belief there in East Timor. But eventually, after all of the violence that happened in 1999, East Timor was able to declare they were able to secede away from Indonesia and declare themselves an independent country. Then of course we have assertion of independence. You have a state would declare its independence. Okay. Then we have by agreement or treaty. If you can recall the Treaty of Paris, while the Philippines, Guam, and the Caroline Islands or subjects of a sale, the Treaty of Paris also has a provision there that calls and maintains Cuba as an independent state. Although reading back Cuban history before Fidel Castro, because that started with the Treaty of Paris up until Castro came to power. That's virtually an American-backed regime at that time. Although the independence of Cuba is retained, all control or influence is being dictated by the United States. Alright? Now, so that's the situation there in Cuba. But well, eventually, when Fidel Castro took power, of course, he removed all US influence or interest inside the country. Right? Then last one would be attainment of civilization. So this involves, the civilization is usually, as I said, this forms through many thousands of years ago. Okay, so for example, Japan, of course, they have this belief that their first emperor is a god, diba? Si Amaterasu, okay. Sa Thailand, it's a long monarchy spanning back 2,000 years. I think 2,000 years if I'm correct. Although there would be Western interference from time to time, especially in the 1900s, because of, well, sometimes the British. Nonetheless, Thailand, or by the time they are known as Siam, they are considered independent insofar as, of course, complying with the four elements of the state is concerned or are concerned. Okay. Then the last one would be Ethiopia. Ethiopia is actually it's a country for they existed even before Christ existed. Okay. Right now, of course, magulo sila. They have this regime, but of course, the concept of having a state called Ethiopia, that should run back from the start. All right. So that should run back from the start. All right. Okay. So then we now have this concept of principle of state continuity. Okay. So of course, you might have observed, especially us in the Philippine setting. Of course, we were colonies of Spain. Then we were ceded to the United States. Okay. So by the changing of the guard or changing of sovereign leaders or of control of sovereignty, the next question is, well, would the acts be considered as continuous in character? So this is where the principle of state continuity will enter. So according to this principle, from the moment of its creation, the state continues as a juristic being, notwithstanding changes in its circumstances, provided that it does not lose any of its essential elements. A mere change in state representation or the ruling individual works no change in the national sovereignty or its rights. So how am I going to give an example of this? One good example would be national debt. I mean, not national debt. Debt, okay? Debt. Because we have loans, okay? Of course, the national debt is included because sometimes we include loans as part of our you call this, we get to compute the government has to compute it, okay? So one good example would be the budget, okay? Budget in a sense of course, mere change of, let's say, debt, okay? What's the debt of each of a state? Why? Of course, the state would borrow money for loans. That is why we have the IMF, World Bank. Okay, we have the IMF, World Bank to draft, to suggest what are they going to enter as investment. The World Bank will provide for money, diba, to lend, especially developing countries. Now, of course, what will happen if there would be a change of regime, or there would be, let's say, the Philippines changed its government. There was a revolution. There was a revolutionary government. Let's put it to an extreme. So what will happen if there is a revolutionary government? Would the debts incurred by that country can the new regime say that, well, it did not happen with my regime, we're not going to pay it, we're not going to comply with that alleged obligation because it did not happen at my time, okay, or that I was the leader or this government. All right, the answer there is they cannot raise that as a defense or as a justification not paying debts, because when we speak of debts, it's naturally a continuing nature. This is where the principle of state continuity will come, because even if there is a regime change, the state is still liable for any other loan or any other obligation, especially if the loan is an international obligation. Okay, so again, as stated in the Sapphire case, of course, a mere change in state representation or the ruling individual leader works no change in the national sovereignty or rights. All right, okay, then how does a state how would the state, or how does a state ceases to be, or well, are states vulnerable to extinction? Of course, the answer there is, of course, it is possible that a state may die in a legal sense. Okay, of course, there are other factors like, for example, disease, of course, pandemic, natural disasters. There is a possibility that, you know, a state might be very much affected. Okay, it might be very much affected. The usual example here would be, if you read the history of Ireland in the 1840s, there was this tomato famine. What do I mean by potato famine? So in Ireland, their number one produce and export, their bread and butter, was planting and harvesting potatoes, mga patatas. And for some reason in 1840, a mutation of the plant affected the harvest, in a sense that potato farmers cannot harvest because the potatoes are that bad. What happened during that period of famine? Of course, aside from people who died, a lot of Irish persons there, a lot of the Irish decided to migrate outside Ireland. That is why it is said, even up today, the population of Ireland is not that it's not that big as compared before the 1840s. So I think if I can recall, the population of Ireland just placed around 7 million, if I'm correct, 7 or 8 million, but it has not yet surpassed, or it has not yet matched its population in the 1840s, before all of the deaths and the immigration of the Irish to the United States affected that. All right, so that's an example of a disease that may affect, it might affect the extinction or the lessening of the state, the population. Of course, the worst thing would be the death of the state. All right, then we have man-made causes of extinction. So for example, merger. This is usually an agreement of the countries if they wanted to merge. Then we have, of course, annexation, but annexation is related to war. That's the usual theater of operations of states in order to have complete control of anything that they plan to invade. All right. Then we have dissolution or breaking up. So when we speak of dissolution or breaking up, there is an original state, but eventually the states divided themselves into other states. That's what happened to Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. That also happened to Yugoslavia. But well, the creation of states under the former Yugoslavia, as I said, there was a bloodbath between both sides, that there were accusations and claims. Of course, some of the accusations are proven, although hindi lang natapos yung trial, but it was proven. there were a lot of atrocities, diba, at the time. That's why breaking up states and creating new ones is something which is, well, also bloody, to say the least. Okay, so and my example there is usually si Yugoslavia, because after they dissolved Yugoslavia, of course, what happened was the Third Balkan War. Okay, all right, then succession of states. So what is this concept of succession of states? So succession of states happens when one state assumes the rights and some obligations of another state due to certain conditions of the latter. So this concept of succession of states can be divided into two parts. It can be universal succession, which is, of course, the state is totally dismembered or merges with another to form a new state. Then, of course, the international personality is completely absorbed. Then we have partial succession. What does partial succession means? It's either a portion of the territory of the state secedes or ceded to another, or an independent state becomes a protectorate or suzerainty, or when a dependent state acquires full sovereignty or independence. Okay? Then, of course, what would be the consequences of state succession of the predecessor state? Of course, there are a lot of economic, social factors, but of course, there would be effects on the people. It will going to have an effect on the laws. It will going to have an effect on treaties, as well as effects on rights. Okay, we have to go back dun sa effects of the law. So if you can recall our discussions in Constitutional Law 1, there is this concept of, it depends if the law is political or non-political, because if the law is essentially political in nature, if there would be a new regime, the old rules in that political law, as long as it involves political law, it's considered superseded or abrogated already. Okay, that's the effect. Okay, but of course, if the issue is non-political in character, the laws by the previous state successor, unless of course the new regime will pass a new law relating to that, the same would still be, the effect would still be that emanating. That's going to be the starting point there. Remember, diba, if we speak of political laws, if there's a change of regime, it's going to be superseded, or the previous one would be abrogated. As to non-political laws, well, life goes on. Yeah, it's more or less life goes on, unless there would be an issue on, misuse of prerogatives and all of that. But more or less, it's non-political laws would have still the same full force and effect, unless the same is, amended. So what's a good example of that? Of course, the revised penal code. The revised penal code is a 1930 law. The first version, but before that, we were complying with, or what we are using, the old Spanish penal code of, I think, 1880 and 1889. So diba, napansin nyo, even in your SCRAS, if you, or hindi pala SCRA, if you read it sa SCRA or sa Philippine reports, there is an explanation as to whether or not was there a regime change. If there is a regime change, if there's a determination whether or not the law should be political. Okay, is it political in nature? If it's political in nature, that's going to be subject of scrutiny. If it's not non-political in nature, it just exists. Okay, it's still continuing, even as there would always be a change of the regime. Okay. Then we have succession of government. So when we speak of, we have to distinguish it between succession of states. When we speak of succession of states, it refers to a state being succeeded by another co-equal state with the same elements. But it's also important to note that, especially in countries where they love to do protest, okay, they love to they love to express their freedom of expression, there will always be this result to either a peaceful or a violent succession, depending if the one would give against the other or one would assert, diba? So there's a difference, because in governments you change the regime, but again, going back again the principle of state continuity, going back to other principles, that state cannot just assume, okay? They just cannot assume their leadership automatically, all right? Because there should be there should be elements, there's a compliance with the elements for the succession of governments, all right? Of course, we have here an outline, of course, as to recognition. Of course, when we speak of recognition, of course, you would see that, well, to be recognized, you need to be recognized to be considered as a state entity. But of course, the next question is, how are you going to get recognition? Of course, you have to consider the community of nations as well as the non-state actors like international organizations. Why is this the discussion? So we have two theories on state recognition. Of course, the majority view would suggest that recognition is declaratory. That means that the entity being recognized already possesses the status of an international person, and because of that, well, recognition is considered political and discretionary. There is also, of course, the minority view that recognition is constitutive. According to the minority view, recognition is the last indispensable element that constitutes the entity being recognized as an international person. That in doing so, of course, recognition is legal and mandatory and may be demanded by any entity that can establish its possession according to the four elements of the state. Then how is recognition extended? Generally, recognition is, well, extended by individual states or a number of them together. Now, who has this power to recognize? Of course, the president has the authority to recognize a state. And what would be the basis? Okay, I think we already discussed the kinds of recognition. It can be by treaty, it can be let's go back to that slide. Okay, let's go back to that slide. So of course, when you recall the creation of states, of course, it's and as well as of course extinction of the state, you would see the life cycle, diba? The life cycle in the sense that, of course, you have to determine the elements of the state as well as the mode of succession. All right. Okay, then of course, under the Constitution, the president has, of course, the treaty-making power. He has the power to send diplomatic representatives. He has the military power and other discretionary powers under the Constitution. Okay. Of course, this is subject, of course, to later on, if someone will question that acts of the executive, well, of course, it can be raised to the Supreme Court, where it would determine whether or not there is a grave abuse of discretion in exercising these particular treaty provisions. All right. Okay. Then, of course, we have kinds of recognition. We have express recognition. It should be either verbally or in writing. Then implied recognition. So when a recognizing state enters into the official intercourse with the new entity by exchanging diplomatic representatives, engaging into treaties dealing with relations, recognition of its flag, or otherwise forming international relations with it. Then, of course, what would be the test for a clear indication of intention? So it is to treat the new state as such. So, and of course, to accept the new government and the recognition of belligerent communities, if there are any. All right. Then, of course, objects of recognition, we have state recognition, recognition of government, and recognition of belligerents. Okay, so of course, we first discussed the concept of state recognition per se. Of course, state recognition per se is the free act of which one or more states acknowledge the existence of an entity which is complete with all the elements of the state and welcoming them into the international community. It may be peaceful, or as a peaceful, it may be through peaceful means, or it may be also through as a result of a war or a revolution. The recognition of government. So what's the basis of the recognition of governments? These are more or less political considerations. Then within this concept of recognition of governments, if there would be two disputed governments, there would be a determination of whether one is a de jure as opposed to the other, which is a de facto government. Of course, if you read the case of, I think this is the Dizon case. This was after the war. So the case of I think it's Dizon versus Valdez Tanque. The Supreme Court kind of discussed the three kinds of de facto government. So one would be an internal revolt or civil war. One would be a course of war or foreign invasion, and the last one would be succession or a part or parts of a state. Alright. And of course, we have now principles and doctrines on government recognition. Sometimes sumusulpot to sa bar exam. Just try to memorize and take into consideration these principles and doctrines. So we have the Tobar or Wilson Doctrine, the Stimson Doctrine, and the Estrada Doctrine. Among these three, the Estrada Doctrine is, if you're going to read, they have a bit radical interpretation. So what would be the Tobar and Wilson Doctrine? Recognition should not be extended to any government established by any form of internal violence until the freely elected representatives of the people have organized a constitutional government. So what does this mean? If a country is in revolution, it is in the prerogative of the other state who would exercise that act of state recognition to determine if there is internal violence. Of course, it's hard to declare them as recognized. This just only when, of course, there would already be a democracy. There would be an election of freely elected representatives for the people, in which the case would now differ. Okay, it would now differ. Then we have now the Stimson Principle. So according to the Stimson Principle, recognition should not be extended to any government established by external aggression. Okay. Then we have now the Estrada Doctrine. So the Estrada Doctrine provides that any diplomatic relations made is not indicative of any permanent recognition of the government, either precipitately or a posteriori. Okay. Alright, so that would be your principles and doctrines on government recognition. Then of course, what would be the elements of a legitimate government? So of course, it has effective control of the machinery of the state. It enjoys popular acceptance or acquiescence. It is able to comply with international obligations, and it is recognized by a great number of states. Alright, so of course, what would be now the effects of recognition of states and governments? Of course, there would be full diplomatic relations to be established. Well, the recognized state or government acquires the right to sue in the courts of the recognizing state. So, of course, by extension, mag-extend na rin yung tradition on sovereign immunity from suits. Okay? Then the recognized state or government has the right to the possession of properties of the predecessor in the territory of the recognizing state. Then finally, the retroactive effect upon all acts of the recognized state, thus preventing the recognizing state from passing upon their legality in its own courts. Alright, then let's discuss a bit about belligerency. So there is this concept of recognition of belligerency. So when does belligerency exist? It exists when the inhabitants of a state rise up in arms for the purpose of overthrowing the legitimate government. So you have to compare belligerent communities or a belligerent movement from that of insurgency. Of course, insurgency is the initial stage, while belligerency is the more serious and widespread consequence of insurgency. Insurgency is directed by military authorities while belligerency is under a civilized government. Then insurgency is not recognized, but belligerency has rules for recognition. So what would be the example here? The example here would be, of course, some regions of Mindanao where military control they assert their military control from time to time. But in doing so, they are just combating insurgency. These are more or less insurgency responses. Okay, because there's only a need to to control or to maintain the peace and order rather than creating something. That's the point there. Okay, insurgency is just the flashpoint. Now, of course, it would depend now on the executive, where are they going to go forward into dealing with the insurgency. Okay, all right. But when we speak kasi of belligerency, it's usually a bit of a close-knitted community. That's why if you're going to compare it with insurgency is merely a military activity, while belligerency, the belligerent community can even technically try to form a nation or a government separate and independent from the mother, the mother state. Okay. Of course, what is the stages of belligerency? Of course, the early stages would be in insurgency, but eventually, if the conflict aggravates or widens, there should be now a formal recognition of belligerency. Okay, so you would just read, of course, what's going to be the elements of recognition of belligerency. Of course, there should be an organized civil government directing the rebel forces. The rebels occupy substantial territory. The conflict of government and the rebels must be serious in nature, and the rebels are willing to observe the laws on war. Okay, so when we speak now of belligerency, of course, this is already, although this is domestic in character, the international humanitarian law would suggest that, well, it's possible that IHL can be applied under any circumstances, even if the country that is doing that, even if the belligerent community in that mother country is it's, as I said, it creates a community by itself, diba? Since it creates a community by itself, they can practically declare anything there if they want. And of course, what would the consequences of recognition of belligerency? A belligerent community is considered a separate state for purposes of conflict it is waging against the legitimate government. So hostilities or atrocities, if any, shall be governed by the laws on war. The relations from other states shall be subject to the laws on neutrality. The parent state shall not be liable for damages made by belligerents. Belligerents shall have the right to search, of course, upon merchant vessels. These are rights that are afforded by independent states. These are now, also considered as rights by belligerents. Okay, so full war status, and may establish blockades, maintain price courts, and other allowable war measures. Then finally, recognition of belligerent by third states. So it would be only effective as only to them, but it does not bind other states, not extending recognition. So this is our discussion on recognition of states.